Elijah Carter took a slow, measured breath as he pushed open the diner door. The bell above jingled, cutting through the low hum of conversation inside. The heavy smell of grease, coffee, and stale cigarette smoke hung in the air. His boots scraped against the cracked linoleum floor as he walked in. The bikers in the corner fell silent, their laughter replaced by sharp, assessing stares. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with a snake tattoo curling up his neck, leaned back in his chair and gave a crooked grin. "Well, ain't this a sight?" the man drawled, his voice carrying across the diner. "Looks like we got ourselves a cowboy. Lost your herd, partner?" The other bikers chuckled, their voices low and mocking. Elijah didn't respond. He met the man's gaze steadily, his face betraying nothing. Tension coiled in the room like a spring. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a name tag that read Debbie, looked between the bikers and Elijah, her mouth opening as if to say something, then closing again. Her hand trembled as she poured coffee for a trucker at the counter. "Just coffee," Elijah said, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, but firm. Debbie nodded quickly, almost spilling the pot as she poured. "Hey, cowboy," the snake-tattooed biker called again, louder this time. "Don't you got any manners? Or are you too good to say hello?" The room was deathly quiet. Even the trucker at the counter stopped chewing his pie mid-bite, his eyes darting nervously between Elijah and the bikers. Elijah turned slightly, his hand brushing the edge of the counter, where a napkin dispenser gleamed dully under the neon light. "I'm just here for the coffee," Elijah said, his tone even, but the undertone of warning was unmistakable. The biker laughed, loud and exaggerated. "Well, looky here, boys. We got ourselves a tough guy. Thinks he can just walk in here and ignore us." Another biker, this one with a jagged scar running down his cheek, leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Maybe he don't know who we are," he said, his voice slow and deliberate. "Maybe we oughta teach him." Elijah's grip tightened imperceptibly on the counter. He glanced at Debbie, who was now frozen in place, her face pale. A bead of sweat rolled down her temple. She looked at Elijah, then at the bikers and back again, her lips parting in a silent plea. "Don't do it," her eyes seemed to say. The bell above the door jingled, breaking the moment. A man in a sheriff's uniform stepped in, his presence like a rock thrown into a still pond. The bikers stiffened slightly, their grins faltering. Sheriff Tate was an older man with a weathered face and a no-nonsense air about him. He scanned the room, his sharp eyes taking in the scene. "Afternoon, folks," Tate said, his voice calm but authoritative. He nodded at Debbie, then turned his gaze to the bikers. "Y'all behaving yourselves?" The snake-tattooed biker's grin returned, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Always, Sheriff," he said smoothly. "Just having a friendly chat with the cowboy here." Tate's gaze shifted to Elijah, who gave a small nod. "That's so?" "Just having my coffee," Elijah said. The sheriff lingered for a moment, then nodded. "Good. Let's keep it that way." He walked to the counter, tipping his hat to Debbie as she poured him a cup of coffee. The bikers muttered among themselves, their bravado momentarily dampened. But as Tate sipped his coffee, their voices picked up again, louder and more taunting. "Guess the cowboy needs the sheriff to fight his battles," one of them sneered. Another chimed in, "Bet he don't even know how to use that belt buckle he's wearing." Elijah turned slowly, his gaze steady as he looked at the group. He didn't say a word, but the weight of his silence was heavier than anything he could have said. The bikers fell quiet, their smirks faltering under his stare. Then, in a move that shocked everyone, Debbie slammed the coffee pot onto the counter with a loud clang. "Enough!" she snapped, her voice trembling but resolute. "This is my diner, and I won't have you causing trouble. Either you sit there and eat your food, or you get out." The room was stunned into silence. The bikers exchanged glances, then reluctantly settled back in their seats. Debbie's hands were shaking as she picked up the coffee pot, but her jaw was set with determination. Elijah tipped his hat to her. "Thank you, ma'am," he said softly, taking his coffee and walking to a booth by the window. The tension in the room slowly ebbed, but the weight of what had just happened lingered in the air. From his seat, Elijah watched as the sheriff finished his coffee and stood to leave. Tate paused by Elijah's table, his hand resting on the back of the booth. You've got a way of stirring up trouble without lifting a finger, Tate said, a hint of a smile in his voice. Elijah looked up at him, his face unreadable. Trouble has a way of finding me. The sheriff nodded, then tipped his hat and walked out. The bell above the door jingled one last time, and Elijah sipped his coffee, his eyes fixed on the horizon outside the window. Mitch Harper leaned back in his chair, balancing it precariously on two legs, and lazily smirked. His snake tattoo seemed to writhe as his muscles shifted under the dim light of the Rusty Spoon Diner. "Is the tourist lost?" he drawled, his voice loud enough to make everyone look up. The rest of the bikers erupted into laughter, their jeers bouncing off the cracked linoleum and faintly flickering neon sign. The waitress, Maggie Porter, froze for a moment near the counter, her hands clutching her order pad. She shot a quick glance at Elijah Carter, her face pale but her eyes silently asking, "You okay?" Elijah met her gaze with a small nod, then turned back to Mitch. "Just passing through," he said evenly, his voice steady despite the weight of every eye in the diner on him. "I'll take a cheeseburger and a coffee." Maggie hesitated for a second longer before scribbling down the order and heading back to the kitchen. Elijah could feel the biker's eyes boring into him as he sat down at a booth near the window, his back deliberately to the wall. He wasn't about to give them any advantage. "Cheeseburger, huh?" Mitch sneered, leaning forward now. "Must be a big treat for someone like you. Bet you don't get much decent food where you're from, huh?" His words dripped with insinuation, the kind meant to bait and belittle. Elijah didn't respond, which only seemed to irritate Mitch more. "You deaf cowboy?" Mitch said louder, slamming his boot onto the floor as if to demand Elijah's attention. The diner fell into a thick silence. The other patrons, a trucker hunched over his pie, an older couple sitting stiffly in the corner, looked anywhere but at the confrontation brewing in the center of the room. Even Sheriff Tate, who had left minutes ago, seemed like a distant memory now, his authority evaporated in the thick, oppressive atmosphere Mitch created. Maggie returned with Elijah's coffee, her hand shaking just enough to make the liquid tremble in the cup. She set it down in front of him and muttered, "Your food'll be right out." Before she could retreat to the counter, Mitch's hand shot out and grabbed her wrist. "Hey, Maggie," he said with mock sweetness, "you ever think of quitting this dump and working for me? Bet you'd make more tips riding with us than slinging coffee for these deadbeats." Maggie's face flushed red, her lips pressing into a tight line as she yanked her arm free. "I'm fine where I am, thanks," she snapped, though her voice trembled with the effort to sound brave. Mitch laughed, a cruel, grating sound, and turned his attention back to Elijah. "See that, cowboy? Even Maggie's too good for this place. What about you? You think you belong here?" Elijah took a long sip of his coffee before answering, his tone calm but firm. "I'm just here for a meal, friend. Don't want trouble." "Trouble?" Mitch leaned forward, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Who said anything about trouble? We're just having a friendly conversation, right, boys?" The bikers grunted their agreement, their grins sharp and mean. One of them, a wiry man with a jagged scar running from his temple to his chin, kicked at Elijah's boot under the table. Elijah didn't flinch. He set his coffee cup down deliberately, his hand steady as he locked eyes with Mitch. The diner held its breath. "Listen," Elijah said quietly, his voice carrying just enough weight to make the room lean in. "I'm not here to make enemies, but I'm not the kind of man you want to test." The scar-faced biker laughed sharply, breaking the tension with a mockery that made Maggie wince. "You hear that, Mitch? He's not here to make enemies. Maybe we ought to roll out the red carpet for him." Mitch's smirk deepened, but there was something darker behind his eyes now, a challenge Elijah recognized all too well. "You know what, cowboy? I think you're right. Maybe we got off on the wrong foot. How about a toast? You got your coffee and I got mine." He raised a stained mug, the contents sloshing dangerously close to the edge. "To new friends." Elijah didn't move. Mitch's grin widened. "What's the matter? Too good to drink with us?" The room seemed to tilt, the air growing heavier. Maggie stood frozen behind the counter, her hands gripping the edge as if to steady herself. "I'll drink when I feel like it," Elijah said finally, his tone clipped but unwavering. Mitch's mug slammed onto the table, the liquid spilling over. The sound made Maggie flinch, but Elijah didn't so much as blink. "You got a smart mouth for someone so far from home," Mitch snarled, his earlier humor replaced by something colder. Before Elijah could respond, the door jingled again. Sheriff Tate stepped back in, his sharp eyes immediately taking in the scene. "Everything all right here?" he asked, his tone casual but with an edge of warning. Mitch leaned back in his chair again, his smirk returning. "We're just welcoming the cowboy, Sheriff. No harm in that, is there?" Tate's gaze lingered on Mitch for a long moment before shifting to Elijah. "You good, Carter?" Elijah nodded. "Just trying to enjoy my coffee." The sheriff's presence deflated some of the tension, but Mitch wasn't done. "We'll see you around, cowboy," he said, his voice low and pointed. "Next time, maybe you won't have the sheriff holding your hand." Elijah didn't respond. He just watched as Mitch and his crew finally left, their boots thudding heavily against the floor. The room seemed to breathe again, the oppressive weight lifting as the door closed behind them. Maggie approached Elijah, her voice barely above a whisper. "You should be careful," she said, glancing nervously at the window where the bikers' motorcycles roared to life. "They don't forget people who stand up to them." Elijah nodded, his jaw set. "Neither do I." Mitch Harper leaned forward, his boots scraping against the floor as he closed the space between him and Elijah. The scent of cheap whiskey and stale cigarettes clung to him like a second skin. His smirk had vanished, replaced by a look that was equal parts menace and curiosity. "Well, cowboy," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Is there anything you can help me with?" Elijah didn't flinch. He remained seated, his hands loosely folded on the table, the steam from his coffee curling upward like a ghost between them. His eyes met Mitch's with a calmness that only seemed to enrage the biker further. "That depends," Elijah replied evenly. "Do you need something?" The diner was silent again, the tension so thick it seemed to muffle the sound of the jukebox in the corner. Maggie Porter, the waitress, stood frozen behind the counter, her lips parted as if she wanted to intervene but didn't dare. Sheriff Tate, now perched near the door with his coffee in hand, watched the scene unfold with narrowed eyes, his fingers twitching near his belt. Mitch chuckled, the sound devoid of humor. "Yeah, maybe I do. Maybe you can help me figure out why a guy like you thinks he can just walk into my diner without showing a little respect." "It's a public place," Elijah said matter-of-factly. "Didn't realize I needed your permission to order a burger." The other bikers laughed, a low, mocking sound that filled the room like a swarm of wasps. Mitch leaned in closer, his face now inches from Elijah's. "It's not about the burger, cowboy," he hissed. "It's about knowing your place." Elijah didn't move, didn't blink. His calm, unshaken demeanor was like throwing gasoline on Mitch's fire. The biker slammed his fist on the table, causing the coffee cup to rattle and spill a few drops. "What's wrong? Cat got your tongue?" Mitch sneered. "Or maybe you just don't know how things work around here." "Enlighten me," Elijah said, his voice still calm but edged with steel. Mitch's smirk returned, but it was colder now. "Around here, you don't walk in wearing that stupid hat and acting like you're better than everyone else. You don't sit in the corner looking down on us like you're some kind of saint. And you sure as hell don't ignore me when I'm talking to you." "I wasn't aware that ordering food counted as disrespect," Elijah replied. The response made Mitch's face darken with fury. He reached out, gripping the brim of Elijah's hat and yanking it off his head. "Maybe you need a little reminder of who's in charge here," Mitch growled, holding the hat up like a trophy. The room seemed to hold its breath. Maggie gasped audibly, her hand flying to her mouth, while Sheriff Tate straightened, setting his coffee down with deliberate care. The older couple in the corner exchanged nervous glances, their hands trembling as they gripped their utensils. Elijah didn't move. His gaze shifted from Mitch's face to the hat and then back again. "I'd appreciate it if you returned that," he said quietly, his voice devoid of emotion but heavy with intent. Mitch laughed, twirling the hat on his finger. "Oh, you'd appreciate it, would you? Well, I'd appreciate it if you showed me the proper respect." One of the other bikers, a wiry man with a jagged scar running from his temple to his jaw, chimed in. "Maybe he doesn't understand English, Mitch. Might be one of those illegals, sneaking in to take jobs and mooch off the system." The comment drew cruel laughter from the group, and even Mitch cracked a smile. Elijah's jaw tightened, but his face remained otherwise unreadable. "You hear that, cowboy?" Mitch said, still holding the hat. "You got papers, or you just passing through like the rest of them?" Elijah's calm exterior wavered for just a moment, his eyes narrowing. "You've got a lot to say for someone who doesn't know a thing about me," he said. Mitch leaned in closer, his grin widening. "I know all I need to know. You're just another stray dog, thinking you can walk in here and act like you belong." "Let me tell you something," Elijah said, his voice lower now, more deliberate. "I don't take kindly to people who think they can push others around just because they feel like it." The room seemed to freeze again. Even Sheriff Tate, who had been inching closer, stopped in his tracks. Mitch's grin disappeared, replaced by something darker. "You got a big mouth," Mitch said slowly. "Maybe I oughta shut it for you." Before Elijah could respond, Mitch threw the hat on the ground and stomped on it, grinding the brim under his boot. The action was met with a chorus of cheers from the bikers and a stifled sob from Maggie, who turned away, unable to watch. Elijah stood slowly, his movements deliberate. He stepped out of the booth and took a single step toward Mitch, his eyes locked on the man's face. "Pick it up," he said softly. Mitch blinked, momentarily taken aback by the command. Then he laughed, a sharp, cruel sound. "You serious, cowboy? You think you can tell me what to do?" "Pick it up," Elijah repeated, his voice still calm but carrying an edge that made the room shiver. "Or what?" Mitch sneered. Elijah didn't answer. Instead, he looked past Mitch, locking eyes with Sheriff Tate. The sheriff gave a small nod, his hand resting near his holster. It was enough to make Mitch hesitate, the bravado faltering just slightly. "You think the law's gonna save you?" Mitch said, turning to glare at Tate. "This here's between me and the cowboy. It's between you and a choice," Tate replied evenly. "You can walk out of here, or you can find yourself cooling off in my jail cell." Mitch's face twisted with rage, but the sheriff's calm authority finally seemed to cut through. He stepped back, his boot lifting off the crushed hat. "Ain't worth it," Mitch muttered, spitting on the floor before backing away. Elijah bent down, brushing the dust off his hat and placing it back on his head. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the diner, the sound of the bell above the door echoing behind him. The bikers watched him go, their jeers fading into silence. Mitch stood rooted in place, his fists clenched as his humiliation settled in the air. Sheriff Tate took a slow sip of his coffee, his eyes never leaving the door. The air outside the diner was colder now, the sharp wind cutting across the parking lot where the roar of the bikers' engines had faded into an uneasy silence. Mitch Harper, his pride stung from the humiliation in front of his crew, stalked toward Elijah with his shoulders squared. The other 5 bikers flanked him, their boots crunching against the gravel with every step. Elijah, standing by his old pickup truck, adjusted the brim of his hat as if he hadn't noticed their approach. He leaned casually against the driver's door, his posture relaxed. The calmness in his demeanor only fueled Mitch's anger. "You think you can just walk out like that?" Mitch growled, his voice loud and laced with venom. "Think you can make me look like a fool in my own town?" Elijah finally looked up, his gaze steady and unyielding. "Back off," he said quietly, his tone even but carrying a weight that made 2 of the bikers hesitate. "This doesn't need to go any further." But Mitch wasn't the kind to let anything slide, especially with an audience. "You don't get to tell me what to do, cowboy," he spat, jabbing a finger in Elijah's direction. "You think you're tough? Let's see how tough you are when it's 6 against 1. Elijah sighed and straightened, his movements slow and deliberate. "Last warning," he said, his voice calm but edged with steel. "Back off before someone gets hurt." Mitch laughed, a short, cruel bark. "Oh, someone's gonna get hurt, all right. Boys, teach this guy a lesson." The first biker, Scarface, lunged forward, his fists swinging wildly. Elijah moved so quickly it was as if he'd anticipated the attack. He sidestepped Scarface's punch with practiced ease and drove his elbow into the man's ribs. There was a sickening crack as Scarface crumpled to the ground, clutching his side and gasping for air. The second biker, a wiry man with tattoos snaking up his arms, tried to catch Elijah off guard, rushing at him with a knife in hand. But Elijah's reflexes were razor-sharp. He grabbed the man's wrist mid-swing, twisting it with a precise motion that sent the blade clattering to the ground. A sharp jab to the man's temple dropped him, unconscious, onto the gravel. The remaining bikers hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances. Mitch, however, wouldn't back down. "What are you waiting for?" he barked. "Get him." Two of the bikers charged at once, their movements clumsy compared to Elijah's calculated precision. Elijah ducked under the first swing and delivered a swift kick to one man's knee, forcing him to collapse with a howl of pain. The second man managed to land a glancing blow on Elijah's shoulder, but it wasn't enough to slow him. Elijah retaliated with a punch that landed squarely on the man's jaw, sending him sprawling to the ground. Maggie Porter watched from the diner's window, her hands pressed to her mouth in shock. Sheriff Tate, who had been casually walking to his patrol car, stopped in his tracks, his hand instinctively moving to the revolver at his hip. "Carter, you sure about this?" he called, his voice carrying over the chaos. Elijah didn't answer. He didn't need to. The last biker, a burly man with a shaved head, hesitated, his fists clenched but his confidence visibly shaken. Mitch, still determined to save face, shoved the man forward. "Get him!" Mitch shouted. The man charged, but Elijah's movements were fluid and controlled. He sidestepped the attack, grabbing the man's arm and using his own momentum to flip him onto his back. The man landed hard. The wind knocked out of him as he groaned and rolled onto his side. Now only Mitch was left. The leader of the bikers stood frozen for a moment, his bravado evaporating as he surveyed the scene. His crew lay groaning or unconscious around him, and Elijah hadn't even broken a sweat. Mitch's face twisted with rage and humiliation. "You're dead, cowboy," he snarled, reaching into his jacket and pulling out a pistol. The move was clumsy, desperate, and Elijah saw it coming. Before Mitch could even raise the weapon, Elijah closed the distance between them in a flash. He grabbed Mitch's wrist, twisting it until the gun clattered to the ground. Mitch howled in pain, but Elijah didn't let up. He yanked Mitch forward, his other hand gripping the back of Mitch's jacket, and slammed him against the hood of the nearest motorcycle. Mitch groaned, his cheek pressed against the cold metal as Elijah leaned close. "This is your last chance," Elijah said, his voice low and deadly calm. "You leave me alone. You leave these people alone, and you walk away. Otherwise, next time, I won't be so kind." Sheriff Tate finally intervened, stepping forward with his hand raised. "That's enough, Carter," he said firmly. "Let him go. I'll take it from here." Elijah released Mitch, who slumped to the ground, cradling his wrist and glaring up at him with eyes full of hatred. "You'll pay for this," Mitch spat. "You hear me? You'll pay." Sheriff Tate ignored the threat, hauling Mitch to his feet and slapping a pair of handcuffs onto him. "You're lucky he didn't kill you," Tate muttered, dragging Mitch toward the patrol car. Elijah retrieved his hat from the ground and dusted it off before placing it back on his head. He glanced at Maggie, who was still standing at the window, her face pale. He gave her a small nod, as if to say it's over now, before climbing into his truck. As he pulled out of the parking lot, the remaining bikers were left to tend to their wounded leader, their bravado shattered. Maggie watched the truck disappear down the highway, her heart still racing. Sheriff Tate, now sitting in his car with Mitch in the back seat, watched it too. "Who the hell is that guy?" Mitch muttered, his voice dripping with venom. Sheriff Tate didn't answer right away. He simply looked out at the empty road and shook his head. "Someone you should have left alone," he said finally, starting the engine. The scene outside the Rusty Spoon Diner was eerily still, save for the groans of Mitch Harper, Danny Greaves, and the rest of the bikers sprawled on the cold gravel. The parking lot's flickering overhead light cast a pale glow over their bruised and battered forms. Maggie Porter, clutching a dish rag, stepped hesitantly out of the diner. Her wide eyes darted between Elijah Carter, standing by his pickup truck with his hat now tilted slightly forward, and the defeated men on the ground. "Who are you really?" Maggie asked, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and awe. She took a step closer, her fingers twisting the edge of the dish rag nervously. "No one fights like that unless—" Elijah turned toward her, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. His hat cast a shadow over his eyes, but the calm intensity in his expression was unmistakable. "Just a guy who was hungry," he said simply, his voice carrying the same quiet confidence that had silenced Mitch earlier. Maggie's brow furrowed, and she shook her head as if to argue, but something in Elijah's tone stopped her. Behind her, customers were beginning to emerge cautiously from the diner, their whispers filling the air as they took in the scene. "I thought they were invincible," the trucker muttered to no one in particular, nodding toward Mitch and his crew. "Never seen anyone stand up to them before." "Not just stand up," the older man from the corner booth added, his voice shaking with disbelief. "He wiped the floor with them." Danny Greaves, clutching his ribs, managed to sit up, his face twisted in pain. "You think this is over?" he rasped, glaring at Elijah. "We'll find you, cowboy. We'll make you pay." Elijah tilted his head slightly, regarding Danny with an expression that was unreadable. "If you want another lesson, I'll be here," he said calmly. "But next time, bring something worth my time." The biting remark made Danny's face flush with anger, but he said nothing more. Mitch, lying on his back with blood trickling from the corner of his mouth, groaned as he tried to prop himself up on one elbow. His eyes burned with humiliation, but there was no trace of the bravado he'd displayed earlier. "You think you're something special, don't you?" Mitch spat weakly. "Just wait. This town has a way of chewing people up and spitting them out." Elijah didn't respond. He bent down, picked up his crushed hat from the ground, and dusted it off once more. With a deliberate motion, he placed it back on his head, straightened his jacket, and walked to his truck. Maggie followed him a few steps, her voice breaking the silence. "Why'd you do it?" she asked, her tone now tinged with curiosity. "Why not just walk away?" Elijah paused, his hand on the door handle. He looked back at her, his expression softening slightly. "Sometimes walking away means letting people like them think they can take whatever they want," he said. "That doesn't sit right with me." Maggie nodded slowly, the weight of his words sinking in. She glanced back at the bikers, now struggling to get to their feet, their egos as battered as their bodies. Sheriff Tate stepped out of his car, his arms crossed as he surveyed the mess. His gaze met Elijah's, and he gave a small nod, as if to say he understood. Elijah climbed into his truck and started the engine. The rumble broke the quiet, and he shifted into gear. As the old pickup pulled out onto the highway, the small crowd left behind began murmuring among themselves, their voices a mixture of disbelief and admiration. "You think he was military?" one customer whispered. "Had to be," another replied. "The way he moved, the way he handled himself. No way that guy's just some drifter." Sheriff Tate walked over to Maggie, his boots crunching on the gravel. "You all right?" he asked, nodding toward the diner. She gave a shaky laugh. "Yeah, just. I've never seen anything like that." Tate chuckled softly. "Neither have I." Inside the diner, the mood was electric. Stories began to swirl, each retelling of the confrontation growing more embellished as customers recounted Elijah's calm demeanor and the brutal efficiency with which he dismantled Mitch's crew. By the time Maggie returned to her post behind the counter, the bikers were slinking away, bruised and humiliated. Mitch shot one last venomous look toward the highway before limping to his motorcycle, Danny helping him steady it. "You gonna let him get away with that?" Danny hissed under his breath. Mitch didn't respond. His jaw was set, his hands trembling as he gripped the handlebars. He knew better than to admit it aloud, but deep down, he understood the truth. Elijah Carter wasn't a man to be trifled with. The power Mitch had always relied on, his gang, his numbers, his intimidation, had been shattered by a single man who refused to be bullied. The hum of Elijah's truck faded into the distance, leaving behind a diner full of people who would be talking about this night for years. Maggie poured herself a cup of coffee and took a shaky sip, her hands still trembling as she stared out the window. "That guy," she murmured to Sheriff Tate, who was leaning against the counter now. "He was different." Tate nodded. "Different enough to make a difference." As the last of the bikers roared off into the night, their tails between their legs, the Rusty Spoon Diner returned to a semblance of normalcy. But the memory of what had happened lingered, etched into the cracked linoleum and flickering neon lights. Mitch Harper and his crew learned a lesson they wouldn't soon forget. Numbers meant nothing against someone who wielded power with control and precision. And Elijah Carter? He left behind more than a story. He left a quiet reminder that sometimes the strongest man in the room is the one who doesn't raise his voice.